Welcome to the webinar, Compensatory Education, Consideration and Eligibility. My name is Vicki Dieter. I'm an Autism Resource Specialist with the Autism Society of North Carolina. So today's topic is especially important in light of the disruption and changes in the delivery of educational instruction, supports, and services due to the closing of schools because of COVID-19 restrictions. The federal law, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, often called IDEA, mandates that eligible students with disabilities receive special education and related services as documented in the student's Individualized Education Plan, for short called the IEP. This training will briefly explain the definitions of compensatory education and describe how IEP teams and sometimes courts determine which students are eligible for each of these services. I will also share current information from the U.S. Department of Education that could influence future compensatory services for students with autism, spectrum disorders, and other disabilities. So what is compensatory education? It is a legal term that's used to describe educational services that courts award to students with a disability for the school's failure to provide the student a free, appropriate public education under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. FAPE is a critical right for each student who has an IEP. It entitles your child to special education services like specially designed instruction, and they also include related services like speech, occupational, and physical therapies. These special education and related services are written in a complex document called the IEP. All services and supports listed in the IEP are provided at no cost to the child's parents. Compensatory education is not specifically required under the rights and requirements of the special education law. But regarding due process rights, the IDEA does address compensatory educations, not specifically naming it, but it does state the court, basing its decision on the preponderance of the evidence, shall grant relief as the court determines is appropriate, which means that if a court decides that a child is eligible for services that the school did not provide, then they can grant the amount of services that they feel are fair for that student. And compensatory education services were created because of decisions reached in court cases that define aspects of compensatory education. And this statement in the special education law permits compensatory education as relief or compensation for a school's failure to provide an appropriate education. And sometimes schools and IEP teams decide a school failed to provide a student an appropriate education, and they determine how to make up the educational services the child lost. So the concept behind compensatory education is to place the student in a position that he or she would have been if there had not been violations under the special education law. And each of these decisions must be made on a case-by-case basis. And the courts have decided that they do not have to be made by an hour-by-hour or day-by-day match. So consider if a student had not been denied an appropriate education. Would the student be in a better place educationally than they are now? If so, compensatory education may be appropriate in order to bring the student's skill levels to the point they would have been had they received an appropriate education. So here are some reasons for providing compensatory education. A failure to provide services listed in the IEP. So let's say a student has 30 minutes of speech therapy per week listed in their IEP, and maybe the school is without a therapist for, say, 3 months. the school may provide compensatory services to make up for the services that that student missed. Another reason is if the school should have been, if the child should have been receiving special education related services, the school didn't identify the student as eligible for services. So maybe the parent asked for their child to be evaluated to determine if they were eligible for services, and the school just refused to do the evaluation. Or maybe the school did an evaluation and they decided that the student was not eligible, but maybe that student really should have been eligible and should have been receiving services. Another reason is the failure to provide a child an IEP that includes special education services and supports to afford that student with an appropriate education. So maybe they did develop an IEP, but that IEP was not adequate to meet that child's needs. Another reason is failure of school personnel to provide services written in an IEP that are calculated to provide an appropriate education. This might include a teacher who would refuse to provide a student with accommodations or modifications listed in their IEP. Failure to provide FAPE that results in an educational deficit, which might be loss of skills or abilities. The IQ of some students can actually drop because they don't receive an appropriate education. And then some students may just fail to make progress. But it can be very difficult to provide a student's lack of progress is because the school failed to provide an appropriate education. However, if a school fails to offer FAPE and the student receives an appropriate education in a private placement that their family may have placed them in, sometimes the parents are entitled to be reimbursed for the school tuition. There have been several important court cases resulting in school districts reimbursing parents for private school tuition. A recent Supreme Court ruling about a student with autism named Andrew F. actually established a higher standard for the school's requirements to provide an appropriate education. So if you look at the slide, you'll notice that the first word in each slide is failure. Obviously, this means the school didn't do something they were supposed to do. There are a variety of possible reasons the school may not have provided FAPE. Maybe they didn't realize they were not doing something that they should have done. Or they may have decided it cost too much money to do what they should have done for a student. Or they could have just disagreed with the parent about what should have happened for that child. But in light of today's circumstances concerning the close of schools due to COVID, this is a completely new situation that took schools and everybody else by surprise and left them unprepared to deal with the situation. The mandated rapid closing of schools left school personnel to figure out how all students would receive their education. The obvious solution was to provide educational services online, but clearly this is not ideal for many students, including students with disabilities. However, with current restrictions that don't allow schools to be open or don't allow school personnel to work with students in person, online services are really the best schools can do, especially with little time to prepare. But the Office of the U.S. Department of Education did offer some guidance. Back in March, they released a fact sheet called Addressing the Risk of COVID-19 in Schools While Protecting the Civil Rights of Students. And one of the things that they say is, if a school district provides educational services to the general population of students, then the district must provide services to students with disabilities. And the other thing that they determined was that if an evaluation of a student with a disability requires a face-to-face assessment or observations, the evaluation would need to be delayed until school reopens. And if a student does not receive services after an extended period of time, the student's IEP team or appropriate personnel under Section 504, this would be for students who have a 504 plan, must make an individualized determination whether and to what extent compensatory services are needed, consistent with the respective applicable requirements, including to make up for any skills that may have been lost. I imagine that initial evaluations to determine eligibility will likely be conducted before any kind of reevaluations, except in special circumstances. The Department of Education also issued some recommendations concerning the waiver of schools' requirements under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And those include if a school district, well, first of all, they basically say the department is not requesting a waiver for any of the core tenets of special education law or Section 504, which most notably include a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. They also determined that the health and safety of children, students, educators, and service providers must be the first consideration. And services typically provided in person may now need to be provided through alternative methods that would require creative and innovative approaches. So while the department's intentions seem clear, we still really don't know much about what will happen when school resumes. Compensatory education services have historically been based on the school's failure to provide services because of a violation, a mistake, or a disagreement. But the nature of the situation and circumstances associated with COVID restrictions, they've really been out of the school's control, and this will likely impact schools' responsibilities for providing compensatory services. Since compensatory education services are not part of the special education law, the decisions about this will probably be defined largely by the courts. And I hope that having more time to prepare over the summer will help schools better meet the needs of students with disabilities next year. Well, we know that COVID has placed a lot of stress on students, their parents, and schools. This really is a time for everybody to try and work together to find creative, effective ways to meet the needs of children with disabilities. And families have really become their child's teacher now, and their input should be considered in developing and implementing their child's educational plans. We know that schools have struggled to deal with significant changes in the way education is delivered. They continue to wait for federal and state guidance about how to deal with the needs of students now and in the future. I mean, they are literally receiving updates all the time and guidance from the federal and state government. We know that children with disabilities will best be served when families and schools can come together to find solutions and to address the challenges that these difficult times have presented for everybody. So I have listed some resources. If you would like to find out more about compensatory education, a really good resource is COPA. The first one listed on your slide is the Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates. Another good law to find out anything about special education is Wright's Law. And then the last listed on here is Understood, and that is a federally funded organization that addresses all areas of disability for students and children, actually adults as well. And don't forget about the Autism Resource Specialist. They're in every county in the state. We're also parents who have children with disabilities, so we do have some firsthand experience, sometimes dealing with what you're going through. And a lot of us have many years of experience. And this link here is to the specific site on the Autism Society of North Carolina website. And you can look on there and find out where your autism resource specialist is in your community. And there are some really good local chapters and support groups in the state. They're led by parents and volunteers who really have a passion for helping and supporting other families who have children with autism. And this is my contact information. Again, I am the Autism Resource Specialist for the Catawba Valley area. And this is my phone number and my email address. And I hope that if you have questions about compensatory education services or any other issues that are related to helping your child, I hope that you will contact me. And thank you very much for joining me today to talk about compensatory education services.